you ever noticed how often the people we celebrate as strong are the ones who dominate, control, and rise above everyone else, while the people who quietly hold on to their values, even when it costs them something, tend to get overlooked or dismissed as weak? And yet, when you really pay attention, those quieter voices often carry far more weight. Welcome to Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be taking a look at 3 readings from the Christian Bible through the lens of sacred myth. As we reflect on the readings for Palm Sunday, we'll explore what it really means to have strength, not as power or status, but as the discipline to stay open, let go of ego, and hold on to your integrity when the pressure is on. In this episode, we're asking an honest question. What if real strength isn't about rising above others, but about staying grounded in your values when the crowd turns, the system fails, or when it would be easier to just go along with it? So grab a comfy seat, a glass of your favorite beverage, and let's look at some ancient stories together in this edition of Mythologizing the Bible, where we'll be looking at the readings for Palm Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. In this series, we're exploring readings from the Bible through the lens of sacred myth, looking for interpretations and lessons that don't require belief in the supernatural. These texts were written by pre-scientific people, shaped by their own cultures, needs, and agendas, not as history books or scientific manuals, but as meaning-making stories for their communities. And just like believers approach these writings through the lens of faith, I approach them through a more humanistic lens, one grounded in the idea that certain foundational values helped humans evolve and flourish. Now, you might agree with the lessons I find, or you might find something completely different. That's the beauty of treating these writings as sacred myth. We're free to negotiate with the text and discover whatever insights we need right now. So with that, let's dive in. As I said, tonight we'll be looking at the readings for Palm Sunday, Cycle A. Our first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 50, verses 4 through 7. Our second reading is from the letter to the Philippians, it's chapter 2, verses 6 through 11. And our gospel reading is from Matthew, it's chapter 27, verses 11 through 54. Now we'll start by going through all 3 of the readings, then we'll look for the messages and the main lesson in each one. Finally, we'll bring everything together, look at what it means for us today, and talk about where we go from here. And with that, let's begin. Our first reading is from Isaiah. The sovereign Lord has given me a well-trained tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being instructed. The sovereign Lord has opened my ears. I have not been rebellious. I have not turned away. I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Because the sovereign Lord helps me, I will not be disgraced. Therefore have I set my face like flint, and I know I will not be put to shame. Our second reading is from Philippians. Christ Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And our gospel reading is an abridged version from Matthew. Jesus stood before the governor, Pontius Pilate, who questioned him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You have said so," Jesus replied. When he was accused by the chief priests and the elders, he gave no answer. Then Pilate asked him, "Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?" But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Pilate offered to release Barabbas, a violent criminal, or Jesus. But the chief priests and elders convinced the people to ask for the release of Barabbas. "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" Pilate asked. They all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him!" Pilate washed his hands of the whole affair, had Jesus flogged, and then delivered him to be crucified. The soldiers dressed Jesus up and mocked him as the King of the Jews. They pressed Simon of Cyrene into service, carrying Jesus' cross to Golgotha, the place of the skull. The soldiers cast lots to divide his clothing, then sat and watched him die. They placed a sign over his head that said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 rebels were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." In the same way, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders mocked him. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and I will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now if he wants him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" In the same way, the rebels who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over all the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of those standing there heard this, they said, "He's calling Elijah." Immediately one of them ran and got a sponge. He filled it with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. The rest said, "Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to save him." And when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. At that moment the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. When the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." All right, so let's go back and take a critical look at these readings and see what learnings and lessons we can find if we dig around just a little bit. So our first reading was from the prophet Isaiah. And there's something really compelling about this idea of having a well-trained tongue to sustain the weary. And from a human perspective, that's not about authority. It's more about responsibility. If you've learned something, if you've gained experience, if you've developed insight, well, then there's this expectation that you'll use it to help others. Not to show off, not to dominate the conversation like so many people do, but to lift people up when they're struggling. That's a very grounded, practical kind of leadership. One that's rooted in empathy and a genuine concern for other people's well-being. At the same time, the passage emphasizes having an open ear, and that's just as important. It's easy to talk about truth and conviction, but this reminds us that growth requires listening, especially when it's uncomfortable. Staying open to new ideas, new perspectives, even criticism, that takes discipline. It means resisting the urge to shut down or get defensive. And in a world where people are constantly being pushed into echo chambers, that kind of openness, it's definitely not a weakness. In fact, it's a form of intellectual courage. But openness doesn't mean passivity. The image of setting your face like flint, that speaks to resilience. the ability to hold your ground when you've done the work, thought things through, and chosen your values intentionally. And not because someone told you what to believe, but because you've wrestled with it yourself. That kind of inner stability doesn't come from external authority. It comes from aligning your actions with reason, empathy, and a commitment to human dignity, even when that puts you at odds with others. So the main lesson I got from our first reading is that true strength is the courage to stay open, speak with empathy, and stand firm in our shared humanity. When you put all this together, what we've got is a model of strength that looks a hell of a lot different from what we often see in the world today. It's not loud or domineering. It's not about always being right or always being in control, in charge. It's about staying open enough to keep learning. About staying grounded enough to speak with care and steady enough to stand by your values when it really matters. That's the kind of strength that actually sustains people. And it's the kind of strength we can choose to practice every single day. True strength is the courage to stay open, speak with empathy, but stand firm in our shared humanity. Our second reading was from the letter to the Philippians. And this passage kind of flips our usual understanding of power on its head. Instead of climbing higher, accumulating status, or asserting dominance, the central movement here is downward, letting go, stepping back, releasing the need to be above others. From a human perspective, that's a very powerful idea, because so much of our culture pushes us to build identity around achievement and recognition and control. But this challenges that instinct and asks us a different question. And what happens when we loosen our grip on our ego and instead focus on connection? That shift naturally leads to something deeper. It's called solidarity. And the idea of taking the form of a servant isn't about humiliation or weakness. If anything, it's about proximity. It's about choosing to stand right beside people, especially those who are struggling, instead of separating ourselves from those folks. That kind of choice requires empathy, but also a lot of humility. You can't genuinely stand with others if you're constantly trying to elevate yourself above them. And in a world that usually rewards status over substance, choosing solidarity, well, it becomes a quiet but radical act. And then there's the redefinition of leadership itself that we saw in this reading. If we take this seriously, leadership isn't about authority. It's about service. It's about asking, what does this moment require of me for the good of others? Rather than, how do I benefit from this? And interestingly enough, the people who live this way often leave the deepest impact. Not because they demanded recognition, but because their actions created something that was lasting. Trust, respect, a sense of shared humanity that can outlive any title or any position. Most of the loudest Christian voices out there today have obviously skipped over this passage entirely. Anyway, the main lesson I got from our second reading is that true greatness is found in letting go of ego and choosing to stand with others. And when you strip away all the religious framing, what you have left is a challenge to how we define success and significance. If greatness isn't about rising above others, but about showing up for those people, right, consistently, humbly, and with intention, well, then that changes how we move through the world. It invites us to measure our lives not by what we accumulate, but by how we contribute. And friends, that's a much harder path. but it's also a much more meaningful one. True greatness is found in letting go of ego and choosing to stand with others. Okay, our final reading was from the Gospel of Matthew. And this passage, well, it's intense, but at its core, it's a study in what happens when integrity collides with power. So one of the most striking elements here is the refusal to play the game. Refusing to argue, defend, refusing to perform in front of these people with authority. Jesus just refused to play their game. There's a kind of quiet composure here that isn't weakness. It's restraint. It's the decision not to get sucked into a system that's already distorted. That's a hard thing to do. In our own lives, when we're challenged or accused, the instinct is to just react, to justify, to defend ourselves, to fight back. But sometimes the strongest move is to simply stay grounded and let your actions speak for themselves. Then there's the crowd. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because it's easy to read this and think, well, I wouldn't have gone along with that. But history, and honestly, everyday life, suggests otherwise. People get swept up. Narratives take hold. Fear, anger, group identity, they can override reason and fairness faster than any of us would like to admit. The choice of Barabbas over an innocent man isn't just a story, it's a warning. It reminds us how fragile our sense of justice can be when we stop thinking for ourselves and start following the noise all around us. It's likely that this is exactly what happened with MAGA Nation in the U.S. And finally, there's the reality of suffering itself. Not avoided, right? Not bypassed. According to the story, Jesus chose to experience that suffering fully. Mockery, pain, isolation, even that sense of being abandoned. From a human perspective, this is where the story becomes even more deeply relatable. Because at some point, most of us hit moments where things shit just falls apart, where we feel exposed or just completely alone. And what matters in those moments isn't whether we escape them, it's how we move through them. Do we lose ourselves? Or do we stay connected to our values, even when it costs us something? Anyway, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading is that true strength is the courage to hold your integrity and stand with the suffering, even when the crowd and power demand otherwise. When you put all of this stuff together, what you see is a powerful example of what it means to live with consistency. Not with perfection, not with complete control, but just living in alignment, staying rooted in your values, resisting the pull of the crowd when it tends to drift toward injustice, and refusing to abandon others when they're suffering, even when it's uncomfortable or costly. That kind of life doesn't always win in the moment, but it leaves a mark. It has a way of waking people up, even after the fact. So true strength is the courage to hold your integrity and stand with those who are suffering, even when the crowd and power demand otherwise. All right, let's review the lessons we've talked about so far. In our first reading from Isaiah, the main lesson I came away with was, true strength is the courage to stay open, speak with empathy, and stand firm in our shared humanity. In our second reading from Philippians, the main lesson I got was, true greatness is found in letting go of ego and choosing to stand with others. And finally, the main lesson I got from our gospel reading was, true strength is the courage to hold your integrity and stand with those who are suffering, even when the crowd and power demand otherwise. When you step back and look at these three readings together, What really stands out isn't power, status, or dominance. It's something much quieter and much harder to sustain. And that's integrity. And not the kind that shows up when it's easy or when it's being rewarded, but the kind that holds steady when everything around you is pushing in the opposite direction. Whether it's the discipline to stay open and grounded, the humility to let go of ego and just stand alongside of others, or the resolve to keep your values intact when the crowd turns or the system fails. The common thread is this downward path, choosing substance over false status, or alignment over approval. And that's where this idea of quiet defiance actually becomes powerful. It's not about checking out or staying silent. It's about refusing to become someone you're not, even when the pressure is real. It's that daily intentional work of holding your ground, of thinking for yourself, supporting others wherever you can, and just staying consistent when it would be easier to drift. Because in the long run, that kind of steady, values-driven living doesn't just preserve who you are. It creates the conditions for something far better to take root. All right, so let's step back and take another look at these readings overall and see if we can figure out what these lessons really mean to us in our daily lives. To do this, I'll try to answer two questions. So what? And now what? Okay, so what? Why should we care about any of this? Well, we should care about this because it reframes where real power actually comes from. In a culture that keeps telling us to win, to dominate, to take control, these ideas push back and say, be careful. When people chase power for its own sake, even under the banner of religion, they often lose the very moral credibility they're claiming to defend. Quiet defiance reminds us that influence doesn't come from holding the gavel. It comes from refusing to be shaped by it. That's how you keep your integrity intact in environments that are trying to reshape you into something that you just don't want to become. We should care about this because not every fight is worth having. Some of them actually cost you more than they're worth. We're living in a time where everything feels like a debate, and the loudest voices often win attention, but not truth. Choosing not to engage in dehumanizing rhetoric, choosing when to just shut up and stay silent, when to disengage, when to refuse the premise altogether, that's not weakness. That's discipline. That's protecting your dignity and refusing to let someone else dictate the terms of your thinking. We should care about this because if you don't build your own internal foundation, someone else is going to build it for you. That's what happens with herd mentality, with all of this misinformation and just the constant noise. Quiet defiance in practice looks like doing the slow, often invisible work of learning, questioning, and thinking things through for yourself. It's building a kind of intellectual backbone so that when the crowd starts pushing in one direction, you're not just reacting, you're choosing. And that kind of stability is rare and incredibly valuable. We should care about this because if the systems around us aren't creating connection, fairness, or support, then it's on us to start building something better, right where we are. Quiet defiance isn't just about what you refuse to do. It's about what you choose to create instead. Small networks of trust, real relationships, spaces where people are seen and supported. That's how change actually starts. Not all at once, but through consistent, values-driven action that others can really step into. Because ultimately, this isn't just about ideas. It's about how we live. And if we don't take responsibility for that, someone else will. And the last question I try to answer is, now what? What are we supposed to do? Well, there's a point where all of this moves from interesting ideas into something a lot more personal. Because it's one thing to talk about integrity, humility, and standing with others, but it's another thing entirely to recognize the small, everyday moments where those values actually get tested. And most of the time, those moments don't look dramatic. And they show up in conversations, in everyday decisions, in whether we choose comfort over conviction when it really matters. So with that in mind, here's your question for the week. What status or ego are you willing to lose in order to stand with someone or to stand for something that someone in power is ignoring or pushing aside? This question matters because it forces you to get honest about what's really driving your decisions. Most of us like to think we're guided by our values, but when there's a cost involved, when speaking up might make things awkward or shift how people see us, that's when the truth comes out. This is where growth actually happens. It might look like refusing to go along with blaming a colleague just to protect your own standing, or choosing not to participate in a conversation that dehumanizes someone, even if it makes the room uncomfortable. And these aren't grand gestures, but they are real. And they build a kind of internal consistency that you can rely on over time. Several years ago, when I was the director of youth ministry at my parish, our pastor introduced me to a younger guy. He's in his early 30s, who was interested in getting involved. And the pastor was, so excited, just really excited. He kept talking about how great it would be to have someone younger working with the teens, how knowledgeable this guy was, how he had a degree in theology, and how important it was to have these strong role models that were closer to their age. So he set up a meeting, introduced us, and more or less assumed we'd figure out how quickly we could plug this guy into the high school program. Now, I knew exactly what the expectation was. I'd just get him involved, put him to work. Don't overthink it. And to be honest, going against that expectation, especially coming from the pastor, wasn't the easiest choice. That's where a lot of people would just go along to keep things smooth. But I had learned over time that when it comes to working with young people, you don't start with what an adult can do, you start with who they are. You have to understand that first. So instead of just handing him a role, I sat down with him and had a real conversation. I asked about his beliefs, how he approached faith, what he thought young people actually needed, how he handled questions or doubts. It was really just a normal screening process, the same one I used for every adult volunteer. And I'm really glad I did. Because as we talked, it became pretty clear that we were coming from two very different places. He was deeply conservative, both religiously and politically, and completely convinced that the church, the Catholic Church, had all the answers. There's no room for questioning. There's no need for exploration. At one point, he said, we need to get these kids when they're young and teach them what they need to know. Otherwise, they'll start listening to the wrong people and start questioning the church. And that was the moment I knew this was a bad idea. Because for me, youth ministry was about the exact opposite. Youth ministry was about helping teens ask better questions, helping them learn to think critically and explore their values and learn how to live with integrity out in the real world. It wasn't about memorizing answers. It was about understanding why those answers matter. What he was describing wasn't formation. It was control. And I knew right then, no matter how much the pastor liked him, no matter how easy it would have been to just say yes, I knew that I couldn't put him in front of our teens. So I didn't. I told him I thought he could help in other areas of the parish, but not youth ministry. And then I had to go back to the pastor and explain why. It wasn't exactly a comfortable conversation. There was quite a bit of tension, but to his credit, he listened and ultimately he respected the decision. Looking back, that moment sticks with me because it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve a big argument or some public stand. It was just a quiet decision to hold the line, to let go of the easier path. Right? Approval, alignment, avoiding conflict, and choosing what I believed was right for those kids. And that's what this looks like in real life. Not some grand gesture, just the willingness to stand by your values, even when it would be easier not to. When you start making choices like this, intentionally, consistently, you begin to trust yourself in a different way. You're not just reacting to the moment or following the crowd or even following orders. You're choosing who you want to be, even when it's inconvenient. And that kind of clarity doesn't just help you navigate tough situations. It shapes your relationships. It builds your reputation. And ultimately, it creates a stronger sense of self. So spend some time with our question for the week. What status or ego are you willing to lose in order to stand with someone or to stand for something that someone in power is ignoring or pushing aside? Well, before I wrap things up, I'd like to leave you with one more thought. Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl said something that brings all of this into pretty sharp focus. Frankl, who understood these ideas not as theory but as lived reality, once wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." What makes this quote so powerful is that it strips everything down to what can't be taken from you. Status can be lost. Approval can disappear. Comfort can vanish overnight. But your ability to choose how you respond, to decide who you are in that moment, that remains. And that's exactly what we've been talking about. Not loud resistance, certainly not performative gestures, but that steady internal decision to hold on to your values when it would be easier to just let them go. And this connects directly to the question we just talked about. Because when you ask yourself what ego or status you're willing to lose, you're really asking, what am I choosing to protect? Is it my comfort, my reputation, or is it my integrity? Frankl reminds us that even when external circumstances are stacked against us, we still have agency. We still get to choose whether we go along with the crowd or whether we quietly, deliberately stand with what we know is right. That's what makes this more than just a nice idea. It really is a practical skill. It's the ability to pause in a difficult moment and say, no, this is who I am. This is how I'm going to respond. And the more you practice that, the more grounded you become. Not because life gets easier, but because you stop outsourcing your identity to whatever pressure happens to be in front of you. All right, we've come to the end of this episode. Thanks for joining me. I'll be back again next week. But in the meantime, I encourage you to engage with our question for the week and pay attention to the important lessons you come across, wherever you find them. You'll create a more purposeful and joyful life, and you'll start to feel more connected to the world and the people around you. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Mythologizing the Bible as we did a deeper dive into the readings for Palm Sunday, Cycle A of the Roman Catholic Lectionary. Remember that steady, values-driven living doesn't just preserve who you are, it creates the conditions for something far better to take root. The Bible readings used for this episode are from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV. Copyright 1973, 1978, 1984, 2011 by Biblica Inc. Used by permission, all rights reserved worldwide. Thank you for listening. If you like this content, please consider telling a friend about it. The more people who hear the positive messages I'm sharing, the better. Mythologizing the Bible is a live-streamed series held most Thursdays at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on twitch.tv/thecodaproject. Every week, the audio of these Mythologizing the Bible presentations is released as a podcast. You can find the podcast at thecodaproject.com or on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Pocket Casts. To learn more, to subscribe to my mailing list, and to keep up on everything I'm doing with the Coda Project, please visit thecodaproject.com.